His 47 feature films should have made him a familiar figure on Hollywood's red carpets, a fixture at its glamorous parties and glittering award shows. Yet Alan Smithee has never attended a film premiere, has never given a single interview, has never even been seen in public.
In the late 1960s, the American film industry was in the middle of a massive sea change. The Hays Code was falling, giving way to the MPAA rating system. Auteur theory, first conceptualized during the French New Wave, was making its way into American parlance with the work of Eszterhas. And in the middle of it all, Robert Charles Totten had a problem. The director had been working on a western, Death of a Gunfighter, but things had gone downhill. The film's star, Richard Widmark, made his displeasure with Totten clear, and at his insistence had him fired late into shooting. His replacement, Don Siegel, did his best to pick up where Totten left off, completing the shoot and seeing the film through post-production. But the final product was a near even split of his and Totten's footage, and common to both was the looming influence of Richard Widmark. Siegel decided that, as he'd arrived so late to the film, it wasn't right for him to be credited as the director, which was a problem, because Totten decided that, since he'd been replaced and half the footage wasn't his, he didn't want to be credited either. See, the increasing focus on the director as the authorial voice within a film, as opposed to the studio, had a side effect. The more credit that a director receives for a film's success, the more blame they'd receive for a failure. And because the problem used to be that studios left crew uncredited, the Directors Guild required that someone be credited as the director. Only the problem now was that no one wanted to be credited. So the Guild came up with a solution, and when crowds filed into the movie theater to see Death of a Gunfighter, they'd be greeted to a new name in the director's chair. Alan Smithee was born. Something that's always been interesting to me is the concept of authorship, specifically as it pertains to collaborative art. The sheer number of hands touching the work ensures a variety of influences are present in the final product. The set dresser might incorporate details from a specific reference they fell in love with, which might inspire an actor to deliver an unexpected take on a line, which might get championed by the editor to make it into the final cut. While we tend to use the director as our representative of authorship, as they coordinate their vision with everyone else, the film can only ever be the product of the material the director has to work with. Shape the machine that makes the material all you want, but it's that material that makes the film.
The point I'm making is that authorship is nebulous, and no assignment of it ever can be accurate. With that in mind, I'd like to talk about Alan Smithee.
Death of a Gunfighter premiered in 1969, the first film ever to use the pseudonym, as a result of the circumstances during production. Reviews were positive, with some even going on to praise the newcomer Smithee for his technique.
Death of a Gunfighter is quite an extraordinary Western. Director Alan Smithee, a name I'm not familiar with, allows his story to unfold naturally. He never preaches, and he never lingers on the obvious. His characters do what they have to do. I'm Roger Ebert.
The Smithee name would soon be retroactively pasted onto the Burt Reynolds piece Fade In, which had also faced troubles in development. This became the standard practice. Directors who felt their visions had been compromised would take their name off the project, and Alan Smithee would receive another notch in his IMDb page. This led to a startlingly prolific career, including such classics as Student Bodies, Ghost Fever, and Hitchcock's sequel The Birds 2, Land's End. While not every film to his name is a disaster, that's certainly the impression he leaves. And the impression is important here, because, from the audience's perspective, Alan Smithee was a real person. This is a deliberate fiction created by the Guild. The illusion of Smithee being a real director meant that a film experiencing creative difficulties didn't have to air those difficulties to the general ticket-buying public. Because the director was sworn to secrecy after invoking him, Alan Smithee created a shield to protect the internal problems facing a film from becoming public, box-office impacting drama, which reveals the secondary motivation behind his creation: to appease the studios and ensure their continued positive relationships with the Guild. And it's there where some of the most fascinating Smithee history comes from. Tony Kaye famously argued for a Smithee credit on American History X, but was refused it after he'd started giving interviews complaining about his mistreatment. All of this poses an interesting question. If an auteur is a visionary whose influence permeates a work, then what does that make Alan Smithee? His presence on the poster is a direct result of a lack of cohesive vision. This implies him to be an anti-auteur, a personification of too many cooks in the kitchen. Of course, the beauty to that is that we can choose to read it both ways. What if we were to interpret the work as the final product of director Alan Smithee's vision, executed to his exact specification? Maybe the turmoil behind the scenes fades as Smithee's name is placed upon it, retroactively making the resulting film his desired result. Looking at this in hindsight, this seems silly, but remember, to the uninformed moviegoer, this actually was the default reading of Smithee's work. Of course, the industry did know, and to an insider, seeing Smithee's name on the poster was an opportunity for a chuckle at some director's misfortune. Over time, it became more of an open secret, and by the late 90s, those with even a passing interest in film could uncover the truth if they looked. And, in an amazing case of someone else doing my work for me, this meant that in 1997, the University of Pennsylvania held a conference celebrating the career of Alan Smithee, with a series of essays from many different authors analyzing his work as one would any other auteur, fully aware of the fact that he did not exist. They even published a book with all of them. I read it. In hindsight, the conference's timing was truly impeccable, because just 2 years later, the industry would suffer a tragic loss. Alan Smithee was going to die, and his murderer would be a man by the name of Joe Eszterhas. Joseph Eszterhas immigrated to the United States with his family as a child, finding himself in Cleveland, Ohio. As an adult, he rose to initial prominence as a senior editor for Rolling Stone in the 1970s, before launching a screenwriting career. After a decade of moderate successes, he wrote Basic Instinct, which released in 1992 to critical acclaim and is likely the work you would know him for. Despite this success, he would fail to replicate it, with an unfortunate series of box office bombs that just didn't seem to let up. And then, on a fateful Friday, he decided to write something different. By Monday, he'd have his first draft of Amok, a film about a director who feels his vision has been compromised and decides to take his name off the project. The twist? His name is Alan Smithee. The only name he's allowed to put on the movie instead is his own. As Joe described it in the first of his books, Hollywood Animal, while Alan Smithee was the Directors Guild official pseudonym, the Guild had not bothered to copyright the name. It meant that any troublemaking screenwriter could kidnap Alan Smithee and use him for his own twisted, perhaps even malicious ends.
To hear Eszterhas tell it, he had written the ultimate expose, a satire so raw and biting that everyone loved it, but no one was brave enough to touch it. His agent tells him that it will ruin both of their careers, and that it's bad for the industry. Steven Spielberg implies that even he wouldn't be so bold as to make such a film. It is a whole thing.
Eventually, the project got off the ground, with Eszterhas producing and veteran Arthur Hiller, the then president of the Academy, in the director's chair. After a disastrous test screening, Eszterhas decided the film needed to be, quote, cut dramatically, and the studio requested he put together his own cut. Hiller disapproved of the changes, but according to the book, helped him make the edits. The studio ultimately chose Joe's cut. Of course, to Hiller, there was now a problem. The producer of the movie had just recut the thing himself, and his directorial vision had been compromised. He could only take one course of action, but he knew what that would mean for the project. And so the retitled Burn Hollywood Burn released to the public in 1997, as an Alan Smithee film.
Did you know the VHS tape for this movie actually says, "Recommend this comedy to friends" on it? It's not a sticker, that's actually written on the tape. I think that's foreshadowing.
Yo! Adrienne! You know, I never one time with her, and we still had a child, so it's a very religious movie, you know? It's the Immaculate Ejection.
That's actually how the movie starts. The credits already have bloopers, but this one gets pushed to the front for some reason. We then get a few cards explaining the core joke of the film to us. Remember, this is a joke that the audience coming into this movie doesn't get. This is the first time they're hearing this. But before you thought we'd get into the movie, it's time for an actual 5 minutes of opening credits against some graffiti. Once we're through that, we find ourselves in the set of Trio, an action movie starring these guys. We meet our director, Alan Smithee, and right away we get to see his struggle as his request for another take gets ignored by the cast and the producer. We'll meet him later. Oh, and then another hilarious title card. It's at this point that the movie becomes a mockumentary, following the story of Trio and its rough development. We're introduced to some suits at Challenger Films, Jerry Glover and James Edmonds. They've hired Smithee, who in this movie is a renowned editor, to direct Trio, because his inexperience as a director will make him controllable. After many script rewrites and constant notes, the film is shaping up to be terrible, but Glover and Edmonds believe it to be excellent, presumably because of its cast. There's a bunch of stuff that happens in the first half of this movie, and to be honest, so little of it ends up being important. We get to see how insufferable the cast is, we get to see how insufferable the producers are, we get to see all the writers they pulled in to work on the script, we check in with Smithee a bunch at a mental hospital. For some reason, Edmonds hires an escort to seduce Alan, and also Alan's wife is cheating on him and took the kids. And the escort that sleeps with Alan is now in love with Alan because he was so kind to her, and also her scenes are shot at a church now. I think this is a joke about how much their encounter changed her. I can't tell because it comes off as confusing more than it does funny. Ultimately, things come to a head in the editing room where Alan speaks up about the movie's problems. Ready for the punchline?
Right there. No! Why are you so insecure you can't take any suggestions?
It's awful. It's terrible. You've sodomized it.
Sodomized it? What the fuck are you talking about? I don't do that stuff.
Please, James, I beg you. My name's on this movie.
Well, you know what? Take your name off it. You can use Alan Smithee.
Oh, I am Alan Smithee.
Yeah, you and hundreds of others. Now that's it.
There's no build-up I'm skipping. There's nothing after this. This is all the gravitas that the central conceit of the film is getting. So an opportunity arises for Alan to take the only master of the film, and he runs off with it. We're 30 minutes into the movie at this point. He calls into Larry King and tells the world that he's gonna burn it. Now the movie takes a detour to make fun of the press for a few minutes, and after it's tired of doing that, we catch back up with Alan, who's at a gas station when he bumps into Stagger Lee, an aspiring actor, and a member of the African-American guerrilla film family. After a weird thing about eating ribs or something,
baby back ribs with hot sauce, black-eyed peas, collard greens.
They take him in, and we find out that Alan Smithee is very with it and watches a lot of black-made indie films. We then find out that the producers are very not with it and pretend to be woke but don't have any actual street cred. The rest of the movie's gonna beat you over the head with this concept repeatedly. Hey, what did the guy that wrote this movie look like again? Right. Eventually, Alan is put in touch with the Hughes brothers. Wait, no, hold on. They didn't want to be in this. Sorry, I was reading the first draft of the script. The Brothers brothers. That's what they went with? Who decide to negotiate with the studio on his behalf. But not before making the joke again.
I say, man, you don't burn the flick. I say what you do is you take your name off that shit. Yeah, you can use that phony name, the one everybody be using.
I can't do that. I am Alan Smithee.
We African Americans, strike one.
We Cossack Americans, that's strike two.
But our motherfucking name ain't Alan Smithee. That's for goddamn sure.
Yeah, that's not much better. The negotiations begin, and after more performative posturing and Edmonds trying to shoot them twice, the studio reluctantly agrees to give Alan final cut over the movie. This is, of course, a trap. The studio's head of security, Sam Rizzo, who is played by the studio has the brothers followed home. Smithee escapes out the window and heads to the La Brea tar pits, where he finally gets on with it and torches the movie. Let's pop back in with Larry King to hear his side of the story.
They killed it. I ended its suffering. I ended the suffering of others who would have had to watch it.
Robert Shapiro shows up. There's a joke involving Dominic Dunn that doesn't scan. Smithee is sent to the mental hospital, yada yada. Thanks to the Larry King interview, the public now loves Alan Smithee. The meddling producers get into a bidding war with Robert Evans for Smithee's life story. Oh, right. Robert Evans was in this movie the whole time, by the way. He wasn't important at all, and he mostly just makes this joke.
Thank you, Daddy.
Lucky daddy. Good thing that incest turns him on.
Oh, and then Smithee has a heart attack. His wife manipulates him into selling his story, but he mandates that the brothers direct it with final cut. The producers then start talking out of nowhere, and I do mean out of nowhere, about how Alan Smithee is now a hot property, and they'd let him direct whatever he wanted with final cut. Don't believe me? Here's the transition.
James was gonna have to give up final cut. The brothers would have it.
Anything. Anything he wanted to direct, I would produce. I believe in closure. I believe in healing. I'll tell you something else. I give him final cut.
Cool.
They keep reusing this clip
Cool.
after every
Cool.
scene for some reason.
Cool.
I think this is all supposed to be a joke, like the brothers now have creative control over the movie, and they really like the clip where he says,
Cool.
That's the best explanation I have. To finish off with the wish fulfillment fantasy, the escort from earlier tracks Alan down at the mental hospital, and then this happens. And then Edmonds tries to shoot himself. Here's the thing. I have the original script. I paid $15 to find a copy. This is how it ends. This isn't directorial drama. This wasn't a reshoot. This is just how it's supposed to go. I don't get any of it. The script doesn't explain it any better.
Okay, the movie's over. We're done. What even was that?
Something I feel the need to talk about right away is this film's sense of humor. Or more appropriately, Joe Eszterhas's sense of humor. The jokes in this movie tend to come in three flavors: calling someone a jerk, poking fun at Hollywood, or being vulgar/sexual/homosexual/crass. Sometimes all three at once. Half the characters get introduced to the lower third describing them. The most prominent joke here is describing all of the women as feminist, because that way it'll be funny when we eventually describe a man that way. But other characters have so much flavor text that the movie just stops to throw up a PowerPoint slide about them. There's a running gag between some of these about Hugh Grant cheating on his wife. Actually, there are several running gags exclusive to these cards. And the sad thing is, if not for how needlessly crass they are, this sort of phrase repetition would actually be kind of funny to me. One notable change from the script to the screen is that a ton of scenes got ported from being described in interviews to being standard movie scenes. This leads to the film breaking out of the mockumentary format randomly. And I'm not sure why they didn't even try putting like a camcorder UI over some of this footage and shaking it a bit, so it looked like something a documentary might have had access to. I'm very confused by it. What else went wrong? Well, a ton of minor plot details and jokes have setups that got cut, leading to tons of dialogue that seems absolutely random. The constant attempts to inject sexual innuendo into things keep stopping the movie dead. Tons of references to the O.J. Simpson trial, Hugh Grant, and other then relevant topics litter the movie, which I can only assume even at the time was grating, but now it's just confusing. All told, half the dialogue feels like it's in on a joke that we're not, and the other half feels like someone wrote one hell of a Family Guy spec script. I think ultimately what we end up realizing is that the joke here just isn't good. The idea of a director named Alan Smithee getting Pagliacci'd is funny when you pitch it, and that is it. It can't sustain an 80-minute movie, and every attempt they made to broaden the plot from there falls flat on its face. This is a movie where half the runtime is devoted to a satire of Hollywood that no one in the audience would ever get. It's basically the superstar limo of movies. Or it would be, if not for the fact that even Michael Eisner stopped returning Joe's emails. In fact, no one in Hollywood wanted to be involved in this project, but Eszterhas interpreted that as a sign that his movie was edgy and daring and saying what everyone else was thinking but secretly too afraid to say, when in reality, he had just written a bad script.
Do I even need to tell you how this thing reviewed? It was nominated for 8 Razzies. It won 5 of them.
Here's the thing. Not only had Joe Eszterhas just made a high-profile disaster, he had made a high-profile disaster that publicly advertised the one thing the industry had been trying to avoid publicizing for 20 years. The entire point of the pseudonym was to protect a troubled movie from negative word of mouth. But if anything, attaching Alan Smithee's name to a project was now sure to generate even more. The Guild had no choice but to make a change, and a few years later, directly as a result of this film, the name was retired. In 2000, the film Supernova was released, with disgruntled director Walter Hill's credit given instead to Thomas Lee. Eszterhas had wanted to credit Hiller as a thank you for his efforts on the film, but he was denied this, as per the Guild rules. Which is funny, because everyone knew this time. And more importantly, the first frame of the film is a slate bearing his name. Joe's agent was right, by the way, not just about the project's impact on the industry. This would be the last film he'd ever write. Until 2006, when he'd write the last film he'd ever write. Now he writes books about how he used to be a screenwriter. He also once flirted with getting into alternative news, and yeah, maybe for his sake I'll stop here.
The real irony of this whole thing, for me at least, is that Burn Hollywood Burn isn't an Alan Smithee movie. It is really nakedly obviously a Joe Eszterhas movie. It is the singular vision of one artist, rendered to his personal satisfaction. Even to this day, he'll admit how much he liked the movie. Alan Smithee was framed, guys. And we killed him for it.